You were never addicted to the substance. You were addicted to the feeling it replaced. Every craving, every relapse, every ritual of escape is not rebellion, but remembrance. This audiobook unveils the forbidden psychology of the compulsion loop, how the subconscious mind transforms pain into safety and control into captivity. Addiction was never about pleasure. It was about coming home to a familiar ache. This sequence neutralizes the compulsion frequency. Stay until the end. The craving must complete its cycle. Preface: the loyalty to pain. Addiction doesn't begin with pleasure. It begins with absence. Beneath every craving lies a wound that once went unnoticed, an echo that refused to fade. The mind, seeking safety, builds patterns around pain because pain is predictable. Pleasure is fleeting, but suffering is familiar, and familiarity feels like control. What looks like self-destruction from the outside is, internally, a form of maintenance, an ancient system preserving continuity through repetition. Addiction is not rebellion, it's emotional architecture. The addict isn't chasing euphoria, they're chasing equilibrium. Through the lens of forbidden psychology, addiction reveals itself as memory in motion, the nervous system's way of rehearsing what it never resolved. Every substance, every ritual, every compulsion is a coded prayer for safety. The drug, the phone, the validation, the routine, all are interfaces for contact with what was once withheld. It is not weakness that sustains the cycle, but loyalty. The psyche refuses to abandon the emotional pattern that kept it alive, even if it now costs freedom. Addiction in this sense is devotion misdirected, an altar built to the ghost of comfort. Underneath the surface, trauma healing begins not with abstinence, but with understanding. The substance was never the problem, it was the symbol. The behavior is a symptom, not a sin. Every repetitive act whispers the same message. Something within me is trying to return to coherence. The more we fight the pattern, the deeper it burrows. Because resistance feeds recognition. What the conscious mind calls destruction, the subconscious calls survival. This audiobook begins not by condemning the pattern, but by decoding it, seeing the intelligence within the wound. Addiction thrives in darkness because secrecy preserves identity. The moment awareness enters, the loop weakens. Observation dismantles automation. By studying the emotional dependency that fuels the compulsion, the listener begins to see craving not as danger, but as dialogue, the body's language of remembrance. The hand reaching for the substance is not rebellion, it's communication. The system is asking to feel again, to metabolize what was once unbearable. Compulsion is not an enemy to destroy, it's a messenger to understand. To see addiction clearly is to stand at the intersection of biology and emotion. It is to recognize that the subconscious mind has been running the same ritual in search of one thing: peace. But peace, when unrecognized, disguises itself as repetition. Each relapse, each return, each promise broken is not moral failure. It's an unfinished cycle. The mind returns to pain not because it wants to suffer, but because suffering is the last place it remembers feeling real. To break the loop, one must not fight the craving, but listen to what it mourns. As we move deeper into this declassified archive, you'll see how compulsion is engineered, how the emotional body was trained to mistake control for safety and repetition for identity. Through the fusion of human behavior and trauma psychology, this exploration will strip addiction of its shame and reveal its sacred design, a map leading back to awareness through the ruins of comfort. Addiction ends not in resistance but in recognition, when loyalty to pain transforms into loyalty to truth. And when that truth finally arrives, it does not roar, it exhales. The nervous system remembers stillness, the breath loosens, and hunger finds no object to cling to. What remains is awareness unbound by need, a quiet returning to wholeness. The loop has not been defeated. It has completed itself. Archive 1. The Architecture of Craving. Craving is the echo of what once soothed the nervous system. It is not born from will, but from memory. The body recognizes absence faster than thought can define it. Each urge, each repetition, is a fragment of unfinished emotion replaying through flesh. The pattern does not begin in the mind, it begins in the pulse. Desire becomes circuitry, linking sensation to safety, even when safety means pain. What looks like self-destruction from above feels like restoration from within. Addiction is not desire gone wrong, it's belonging misplaced. At its root, the craving is architectural, a design meant to hold the psyche together when chaos threatened to dissolve it. The system learned early that intensity feels like stability. It built scaffolding from repetition, layering behavior over ache until pattern replaced presence. The substance, the ritual, the craving, all were blueprints for emotional continuity. Through forbidden psychology, we see that compulsion is not rebellion but adaptation, the nervous system's way of creating order from uncertainty. Inside this hidden geometry, sensation becomes structure. Every pulse of need creates a perimeter, a sense of containment. The loop gives direction to the undefined. Without it, the self feels formless, unanchored. This is why release is so brief. The cycle exists not to deliver satisfaction, but to maintain identity. To lose the habit would mean losing the architecture of self. The emotional mechanism behind craving is not pleasure-seeking, it's shape-seeking. The pattern itself becomes a skeleton. Each relapse, each repetition, is a recalibration of memory. The neurochemical rhythm acts like an ancient metronome, setting tempo for survival. Dopamine is not reward here, it's reassurance. A whisper that the body still knows the path back to familiarity. Craving delivers predictability, not joy. The mind doesn't crave the substance, it craves the certainty of the next moment. The cycle replaces the unknown with choreography. What science calls reinforcement, emotion calls recognition. The deeper you look into behavioral repetition, the more it resembles worship. The ritual of use, lighting, reaching, scrolling, consuming, becomes ceremony, not to celebrate, but to maintain rhythm between emptiness and sensation. Each act a prayer for presence disguised as escape. The addict does not seek intoxication, they seek synchronization. It is the body aligning with what it once mistook for peace. Craving is the body praying to feel real. Every act of indulgence carries a ghost of protection. Pain, however familiar, is loyal. The psyche holds on to it because it once prevented collapse. In the language of trauma patterning, the loop is devotion, devotion to the feeling that once meant survival. Breaking addiction feels like betrayal because it severs the bond with the oldest guardian, suffering itself. Freedom threatens identity. Abstinence feels like abandonment. The psyche doesn't fear sobriety, it fears amnesia. The mind mistakes repetition for refuge. It confuses rhythm with security and numbness with rest. But within every craving is a code, a silent directive pointing back to the original wound. When deciphered, the urge no longer demands satisfaction, it demands remembrance. The loop loses power the moment its language is understood. This is the first crack in the compulsion algorithm, awareness entering automation. The architecture grows more intricate with suppression. Each attempt to fight the craving strengthens the very pattern it resists. Denial and indulgence become mirrors of the same control mechanism. One feeds through pleasure, the other through punishment. Both keep attention locked on the loop. The psyche is not seeking release, it is seeking rhythm. Control is not the cure, recognition is. What you fight survives through your focus. Within neural conditioning, craving functions as a translator. It converts emotional chaos into tangible sensation. Pain that can be felt is easier to manage than pain that's invisible. That's why awareness of craving feels safer than the awareness of grief. The substance or habit isn't the problem, it's the bridge. Remove the bridge too quickly and the river floods. Healing requires learning to swim in what was once numbed. There is a sacred intelligence inside compulsion. It remembers what consciousness forgot, that every repetition began as protection. Addiction doesn't destroy truth. It hides it under routine. Each cycle conceals an unprocessed revelation. When the craving arrives, it's the system announcing readiness to feel. The body doesn't ask for punishment. It asks for participation. The craving is not returning to the drug, it's returning to the moment you lost yourself. As awareness deepens, the behavioral architecture starts revealing its symmetry. Each pattern reflects an old equation. Pain multiplied by repetition equals control. But when observation enters, the formula collapses. You see that control was never real. It was rhythm mistaken for safety. The nervous system relaxes not through abstinence, but through comprehension. You no longer need to fill the silence once you understand it was never empty. In this stage of recognition, craving begins to shift texture. It loses its urgency and becomes information. Sensation without story. The same energy that once drove compulsion now fuels awareness. The dopaminergic current stabilizes, converting agitation into focus. You start noticing subtlety again. The taste of air, the weight of breath, the quiet pulse of calm between impulses. The loop doesn't vanish. It evolves into sensitivity. When craving speaks, it no longer commands, it invites. The tension in the spine becomes a message, not a mandate. The heartbeat that once accelerated with need now synchronizes with observation. This is the moment compulsion begins to fail, not because it's defeated, but because it's understood. Recognition is reprogramming. Awareness removes the loop's only fuel, unconsciousness. Through the field of human conditioning, we see that addiction is not an intruder, but an interpreter. It translates the emotional into the physical, so awareness can finally interact with it. The craving was never a signal to consume. It was an invitation to feel. Every urge you survive consciously rewires the nervous system toward coherence. Each pause between impulse and action becomes a doorway back to self-possession. Relief arrives quietly. There is no battle, only balance. The psycho-emotional circuitry that once oscillated between high and collapse now finds rhythm in neutrality. The craving becomes background noise. A faint hum of history. You don't silence it, you outgrow its frequency. The body no longer seeks anesthesia when it becomes the environment of safety itself. The energy once trapped in repetition begins to circulate. What used to be hunger becomes creativity. What used to be escape becomes exploration. This is not recovery, it's reallocation. The compulsion loop dissolves into curiosity. The psyche, freed from surveillance, starts to play again. Pleasure returns, not as rebellion, but as recognition that aliveness itself was never the enemy. The neuro-emotive network recalibrates. The mind that once measured comfort through stimulation now measures it through coherence. The nervous system learns a new pleasure, peace without sedation. You begin to understand that craving was never chaos. It was choreography for awakening. The loop performed its final act the moment you stopped performing yours. What once enslaved you was only trying to introduce you to stillness. Now the architecture stands transparent. Every pattern that once obscured truth becomes a window. The structure of compulsion remains, but it no longer confines. It supports awareness instead of replacing it. The scaffolding that once held your survival now frames your clarity. The house of pain becomes cathedral, echoing, empty, luminous. In the final unveiling, you realize addiction never wanted to win. It wanted to be witnessed. Every relapse was a rehearsal for recognition, every craving a compass pointing inward. What you sought through repetition was not escape, but return. Return to sensation, to wholeness, to memory made whole. The cycle didn't betray you, it guided you here. Awareness is the end of craving, because awareness is what craving always was. And as silence arrives, you feel it. The system still hums, but softly, like wind through glass. There is no resistance left to feed it. The loop completes itself, dissolving into coherence. You can almost hear it, the body remembering peace as its native frequency. Addiction never stole your freedom. It preserved it until you were ready to feel again. The architecture remains, but now it's made of light. Archive 2. The Pleasure Paradox. Pleasure was never the opposite of pain. It was its disguise. Inside the nervous system, reward and suffering are not rivals but collaborators. What we call pleasure is merely pain recycled through rhythm, softened by prediction. The same pathways that light up in joy ignite in grief. Only context changes the translation. The addict doesn't seek ecstasy. They seek the silence between oscillations, the pause between craving and collapse. Pleasure is the nervous system catching its breath between storms. Through behavioral engineering, we see the trick more clearly. Dopamine, the molecule of anticipation, doesn't reward satisfaction. It rewards seeking. The moment of pleasure isn't when we have, it's when we almost have. This anticipation becomes intoxicating because it mimics safety. The psyche confuses movement with control, chase with power. What appears as indulgence is the mind's way of saying, I'm still alive. The loop is not about reward, it's about reassurance. Within forbidden psychology, this paradox forms the core of control. Entire economies depend on this emotional physics. Give just enough satisfaction to sustain pursuit, never enough to complete it. The system feeds on incompletion, and the addict becomes its most efficient participant. It's not pleasure that enslaves, but the delay of it. The nervous system, suspended in expectation, begins to mistake tension for vitality. The world teaches hunger as identity, desire as existence. Neuroscience names it the anticipation gradient, the curve between want and reward. Yet spiritually, it's an ancient loop of longing. The same circuit that once pushed evolution now fuels dependency. When excitement becomes a constant hum, serenity feels like withdrawal. The psyche, addicted to amplitude, no longer tolerates quiet frequencies. It would rather suffer stimulation than risk silence. The cost of perpetual pleasure is erosion, a slow loss of sensitivity mistaken for strength. Pleasure without stillness becomes punishment. The high fades, and with it, the illusion of control. The emotional body deflates, searching for the next spark to reanimate itself. The addict isn't chasing joy, they're running from the aftertaste of it. This endless swing between expansion and emptiness turns into identity. The self becomes rhythm, defined by acceleration. You don't crave the drug, you crave the disappearance that follows. Through the lens of trauma memory, we see that what the addict calls pleasure is actually recognition, the return to a familiar neurochemical climate. The first high is never chemical, it's emotional. The moment the system rediscovers intensity it once lost. The drug or behavior becomes a prosthetic for aliveness, replicating the heartbeat of chaos. In this way, pleasure is not experienced. It's remembered. And as the cycle continues, the boundaries between joy and suffering blur. The nervous system no longer knows how to separate comfort from control. It calibrates not toward harmony but toward intensity. In this paradox, pleasure becomes a maintenance ritual, the body's way of keeping pain close enough to feel alive, but not so close it breaks. This is the hidden architecture of dependence, equilibrium built from oscillation. Addiction thrives on repetition because repetition feels like rhythm. The psycho-emotional system learns to equate familiarity with pleasure, even if the pattern hurts. The brain releases micro-rewards, not for joy, but for recognition. You crave what you've already survived. The body doesn't want novelty. It wants confirmation. This is how pain becomes pleasure's twin. Both are proof that you still exist inside the loop. Beneath that loop is a hidden law. Pleasure always contains a shadow of grief. The moment satisfaction appears, the countdown to loss begins. This impermanence fuels compulsion. The subconscious believes it can prevent collapse by replaying the high, but each attempt to repeat the experience only deepens absence. The system cannot reproduce ecstasy because ecstasy was never in the substance, it was in the surrender. What you call pleasure was the brief moment you stopped resisting yourself. The neurochemical loop disguises itself as will. The moment of craving triggers dopamine, which signals anticipation. The relief that follows is cortisol's retreat, not contentment. The pleasure wasn't felt, it was the absence of threat. You were never rewarded, you were temporarily released from vigilance. This is why pleasure fades so fast. The nervous system cannot sustain stillness without misinterpreting it as danger. Social programming exploits this architecture perfectly. Media, technology, even relationships mirror the addiction loop. Stimulus, spike, silence, repeat. Each engagement promises control, but delivers dependency. The modern world sells pleasure as freedom, while engineering it as obedience. The addict is not an outlier. They are the mirror of society's nervous system, screaming its secret truth, that satisfaction was industrialized to prevent awakening. Eventually, pleasure turns predatory. The nervous system, overstimulated, begins to hunt for more sensation simply to feel baseline. Calm feels like boredom. Neutrality feels like death. The pleasure paradox completes its circle. You now chase discomfort to prove you're alive. The system has inverted itself. It no longer serves feeling. It serves continuation. What started as escape becomes the only remaining identity. The body adapts by numbing. Receptors dull, signals flatten. The heart becomes mechanical, emotion algorithmic. This is not the absence of pleasure, it's its saturation point. When the system is always fed, it forgets how to taste. The addict's exhaustion is not moral decay, it's sensory collapse. The pleasure mechanism, once sacred, now loops endlessly without meaning. It becomes self-consuming, the fire eating its own flame. And yet, hidden beneath this decay is the seed of transcendence. The system can only loop so many times before awareness pierces pattern. The exhaustion becomes doorway. When every pleasure fails to numb, the psyche begins to ask not what can fill me, but why am I empty? That question is the first sign of awakening. Awareness changes the texture of craving. The same signal that once commanded obedience now triggers observation. The subconscious architecture begins to self-correct. Dopamine's illusion loses its spell, and the nervous system starts preferring peace to prediction. The paradox collapses. Pleasure is no longer reward, but resonance. You no longer seek stimulation to feel alive. You allow aliveness to express without seeking. In this new equilibrium, the body reclaims innocence. Touch feels electric again. Silence feels saturated. Breath tastes like light. The world that once numbed you now vibrates with microscopic pleasure. Not intensity, but intimacy. The nervous system is no longer searching for climax. It is savoring coherence. Pleasure becomes continuity, the constant hum of awareness inhabiting sensation without ownership. True pleasure is not reaction, it's participation. At this stage, craving becomes memory, not mandate. The emotional circuitry that once demanded repetition now functions as signal refinement. You start noticing subtler sensations, the quiet satisfaction of stillness, the subtle pleasure of restraint. Joy stops being a spike, it becomes a field. Desire becomes directionless, transformed into curiosity. What you once called addiction now looks like longing misunderstood. The psyche begins to forgive itself. It recognizes that every indulgence, every spiral, Every fall was not sin, it was navigation. The soul was mapping its own return through error. In the alchemy of consciousness, even destruction is data. You realize that pain and pleasure were never opposites. They were the inhale and exhale of awakening. The nervous system wasn't broken, it was learning to feel again. From this forgiveness grows intelligence, not analytical but somatic. You start moving with life instead of managing it. You eat slower, you listen deeper, you speak less. Pleasure returns as simplicity. Every moment becomes sensual not because it stimulates, but because it includes you. You stop consuming to feel, you start existing as feeling. Now the paradox resolves itself. Pleasure is no longer something to chase, but something to host. The world becomes an extension of your nervous system, landscapes breathing through perception. You sense how every sensation, even pain, carries beauty when no longer divided. The system that once required excess now sustains itself on presence. It feeds on awareness, not excitement. And finally, peace and pleasure become indistinguishable. There is no high, no crash, only rhythm. The loop that once enslaved you now serves as your pulse, not of addiction, but of awareness. The pleasure paradox ends where embodiment begins. The body is no longer a battlefield between craving and control. It has become the temple of balance, where every breath is both surrender and fulfillment. Archive 3, The Safety of Suffering. Pain is persuasive because it feels familiar. Long before logic develops, the nervous system learns to equate suffering with survival. What hurts repeatedly becomes home, and what feels safe becomes foreign. This inversion is not failure, it's adaptation. The psyche internalizes danger as proof of existence. It measures safety not by peace, but by predictability. Pain is constant, and constancy feels secure. We return to pain not because it heals us, but because it remembers us. Through the anatomy of emotional conditioning, pain reveals its utility. The body records trauma not as story, but as rhythm. Every pulse of discomfort leaves a pattern, and the subconscious confuses repetition with reliability. Safety becomes synonymous with suffering because suffering guarantees continuity. The system that fears unpredictability will always prefer pain to nothingness. Silence threatens identity. Ache sustains it. In this state, the behavioral subconscious forms a hidden contract. Better to hurt predictably than to heal unpredictably. The nervous system selects misery over mystery because misery can be managed. It knows the terrain, the triggers, the tempo, the outcome. Healing, by contrast, demands surrender to the unknown. The addict's return to suffering is not weakness, it's fidelity to structure. Chaos is bearable if it's familiar. Freedom terrifies because it requires recalibration. Every relapse is an act of remembrance. The body revisits the same vibration because it still believes that's where safety lives. You can feel it in the muscles tightening at peace, in the lungs holding air as if still under threat. The trauma circuitry activates even in calm moments, searching for the next surge of conflict to confirm existence. Suffering provides feedback. It says, "You're still here." The absence of pain feels like vanishing. The mind begins to build narratives around this pattern. I deserve this. It's just who I am. These are not beliefs. They're stabilizers. They keep the architecture intact. Without them, the emotional landscape would collapse. This is why confrontation with happiness often triggers anxiety. The body misreads calm as void, and void as death. To heal, one must redefine safety not as sameness, but as stillness. In the mechanics of psychological adaptation, pain functions as gravity. It holds awareness in orbit around identity. Remove it too soon, and consciousness drifts without reference. The addict clings to suffering the way an astronaut clings to gravity, terrified of floating into infinite calm. This fear is not madness. It's memory. The system recalls that pain once meant presence. that alertness once meant survival. Eventually, the cycle becomes sacred. Pain transforms from intruder to ritual. Every ache feels like prayer, every wound a reminder of devotion to continuity. The self becomes loyal to its own suffering because it no longer knows how to exist without it. Freedom feels unsafe, precisely because safety has always worn pain's face. The deeper one looks into behavioral trauma loops, the more compassion emerges. Pain is not the enemy. It's evidence of endurance. Every discomfort carries the memory of survival encoded within it. When the psyche repeats suffering, it isn't masochistic. It's mnemonic. The body is rehearsing how it once stayed alive. The ache is not punishment. It's practice. Within the architecture of compulsion, suffering becomes a stabilizer. It sets emotional parameters, familiar tension, predictable collapse, temporary relief. Each relapse reinstates identity. I am the one who hurts but survives. Remove the pain and the I dissolves. This is the hidden grief of recovery, the mourning of an old self built from struggle. You are not only healing wounds, you are burying the architecture that carried you through them. The limbic memory field operates like a time machine. It cannot distinguish between real and recalled threat. When safety appears, the system panics because it feels unrecognizable. Calmness triggers alarm. Rest feels like exposure. The paradox is complete. The organism resists the very state it has always sought. This is not self-sabotage. It's survival logic repeating in the wrong environment. The psyche's loyalty to pain extends beyond behavior into relationships. We bond through familiar vibrations. Conflict feels intimate. Peace feels distant. The nervous system confuses intensity with love, volatility with truth. In the emotional resonance matrix, this distortion explains why we attract what hurts us. We are magnetized to the frequencies of recognition. Every heartbreak is a reunion with the vibration we once called home. The illusion of control hides beneath this loyalty. By anticipating pain, the psyche reclaims authorship of it. Predictable suffering feels like power because it avoids surprise. The system whispers, "If I cause my own hurt, at least it won't ambush me." This self-inflicted control loop is not self-hate. It's emotional foresight, an ancient attempt to negotiate with chaos. Healing cannot begin until safety is redefined. The nervous architecture must learn that peace is not emptiness, that neutrality does not equal numbness. This recalibration takes time because the body's metrics of comfort were written in the language of pain. Stillness must be introduced gradually, like light to a creature born in darkness. If you rush, it blinds. If you pause, it reveals. Pain, once worshipped as proof of being, starts to lose its authority. The body begins to interpret calm as completion rather than collapse. The pulse slows without panic. The breath deepens without guilt. This is the first sign that the loop is breaking. Not the absence of pain, but the absence of fear around peace. When awareness observes pain without recoil, suffering loses function. The somatic program dissolves into sensation, information instead of identity. The body starts to remember that pain was never punishment, only feedback. Once decoded, the ache no longer demands loyalty. It releases its grip, like a system completing its final cycle. Emotion begins to differentiate again. Sadness feels distinct from danger. Discomfort no longer equals threat. The nervous system, no longer addicted to alarm, finds rhythm and rest. This is the restoration of sensitivity, the ability to feel without fleeing. What once triggered collapse now invites curiosity. The same energy that fueled addiction transforms into awareness. Freedom begins when pain stops proving your existence. In this state, healing feels less like triumph and more like surrender. You stop seeking to erase pain and instead learn to host it. It becomes guest, not God. This reorientation dismantles the subconscious contract with suffering. You no longer equate endurance with identity. The body discovers a new definition of safety, one that does not depend on repetition. Through the field of psycho-emotional recalibration, peace emerges as the new constant. The nervous system, once calibrated to turbulence, now measures time by stillness. Life doesn't feel dull, it feels dimensional. Even moments of struggle appear textured rather than threatening. The architecture of pain hasn't vanished, it's become transparent, integrated into awareness rather than opposed to it. Relationships shift accordingly. The magnetism toward chaos fades. You begin to gravitate toward neutrality, people who feel quiet rather than stimulating. The absence of drama stops feeling like emptiness and starts to resemble eternity. You recognize that the need for intensity was never about passion. It was about proof. And proof is no longer required. As the circuitry of suffering dissolves, the psyche enters its most disorienting phase, peace without purpose. Without pain as compass, direction feels uncertain. This is where most relapse, mistaking stillness for stagnation. Yet if you stay, if you breathe through the void, clarity dawns. Purpose is not movement, it's resonance. The body doesn't need a mission to exist, it needs permission to rest. Eventually, peace stops feeling like absence. It begins to glow, soft, stable, unremarkable, yet undeniable. The nervous system accepts serenity as baseline, and identity reorganizes around it. You are no longer the one who suffers to feel alive. You are the one who feels, and that is life enough. The safety of suffering ends when you stop worshiping pain as proof of presence. What remains is existence, unmeasured, unguarded, whole. Archive 4. The Ritual of Relief. Relief is the most seductive illusion the psyche ever built. It feels like freedom, but it is only the intermission between cravings, a pause mistaken for peace. The body learns to chase that moment, not because it satisfies, but because it silences the storm. Relief is not recovery, it's rehearsal. Each repetition of escape reinforces the loop. The substance, the behavior, the thought, all become ceremonial tools in the worship of temporary quiet. Relief isn't healing, it's the nervous system kneeling before absence. Through the science of emotional repetition, the body becomes its own priest. Every act of indulgence is ritual, every ritual a sermon of familiarity. The lighter, the bottle, the scrolling, the argument. They are incantations that summon the same silence over and over. This silence is not peace, it's anesthesia. The psyche's obsession with it reveals a simple truth. It doesn't want to be happy. It wants to stop feeling. Pleasure and pain merge here into one vocabulary: relief. Relief functions like a password that opens the subconscious vault. Inside, the same architecture repeats: tension, release, collapse. The nervous system equates relief with survival, as if every pause from discomfort is proof of life. In truth, the system doesn't want freedom, it wants familiarity. The loop feels like ritual because ritual gives chaos meaning. Addiction is not chaos, it's organized avoidance. Through behavioral design, we see that every ritual of escape is an imitation of meditation, stripped of awareness, but full of pattern. Each ritual has its own choreography. The lighter flicks, the glass clinks, the screen glows, the heart races. The rhythm becomes sacred. The act is not random, it's symbolic. The body performs the same motions each time because it remembers them as doorways to silence. But the silence no longer restores. It resets the countdown to craving. Relief is time-delayed pain disguised as grace. It feels divine only because it ends discomfort temporarily. The cost is continuation. Inside neuro-emotive mapping, relief is simply the body switching channels, diverting awareness from one discomfort to another. The nervous system cannot erase emotion, it can only reassign it. The addict doesn't destroy pain, they rearrange it. The ritual transforms agony into anticipation, despair into devotion. The result feels new, but is always recycled. The pattern sustains itself not through pleasure, but through predictability. Relief is a seductive teacher. It trains the mind to trust interruption more than integration. It promises rest, but delivers rehearsal. The same silence that once soothed now enslaves, because peace without awareness becomes paralysis. Stillness isn't absence, it's space. But the loop cannot tolerate space. It fills it instantly with action. The addict isn't afraid of pain, they're afraid of the emptiness relief reveals. And yet, this fear holds the key. Within the psychological paradox of craving, the need for relief becomes a mirror, showing the soul its own relationship with stillness. What we seek from substances we once felt in silence. Every ritual of escape is a fragmented attempt to return to that original peace. The tragedy is not the craving itself. It's that we forgot peace required nothing to access. Relief is a counterfeit of remembrance. Every addictive cycle begins and ends in the same choreography. Pain builds, action intervenes, calm follows, guilt returns. This symmetry gives suffering its seductive logic. The behavioral patterning of relief convinces the psyche it can bargain with emotion. It says, I can control pain if I control when it ends. But pain cannot be scheduled, it can only be understood. The illusion of control is what binds the loop. At the biochemical level, the pattern is mathematical. Stress hormones spike. Dopamine rushes in to counteract. The oscillation between cortisol and dopamine is the rhythm of relief. The body feels balanced only while swinging. The moment stability appears, the mind intervenes. It mistakes quiet for danger. In this way, the addiction program becomes self-protective. It keeps movement alive to prevent awareness from settling. Through trauma-informed observation, we see the core mechanism clearly. Craving is not about euphoria. It's about escape velocity. The psyche generates craving to avoid the gravity of emotion. The relief that follows is not satisfaction, it's deceleration. The ritual slows the fall, but never stops it. The addict isn't rising toward pleasure. They're orbiting avoidance. Relief's true power lies in its repetition. Each act of temporary escape reinforces the neural association between avoidance and safety. Over time, the nervous system loses its ability to distinguish comfort from control. The ritual becomes religion, a faith sustained by temporary salvation. The addict worships not the substance, but the silence that follows. Every ritual of relief is a prayer to absence. Even withdrawal mirrors devotion. The body trembles not from deprivation, but from disorientation, the absence of the familiar rhythm. Pain was predictable. Peace is not. In emotional reconstruction, this transition feels like death. The nervous system must unlearn its worship of interruption, retraining itself to see stillness as sanctuary, not sentence. Until that happens, relief will always outrun rest. The most dangerous illusion of relief is its impersonation of control. Every pause feels like victory, every collapse like consequence. But both are sides of the same construct, the body policing itself through cycles of suppression and surge. True control isn't mastery over craving, it's intimacy with it. To feel the pull without following is to meet the loop with awareness instead of obedience. Awareness introduces a new ingredient to the ritual, observation. The same actions performed consciously start to lose power. The hand still reaches, the pattern still flickers, but the meaning shifts. Awareness untangles association. The silence that once sedated begins to reveal texture. Sound within stillness, emotion within absence. Relief without reaction becomes reflection. Once awareness enters, ritual transforms into realization. The neural choreography that once bound craving to safety now becomes transparent. You can feel the microseconds before impulse, the subtle tension in the chest before reach, the quiet voice whispering just once more. Recognition interrupts automation. Relief loses its religion. The body begins to rediscover true rest. It no longer confuses numbness with stillness. The breath slows not because it's sedated, but because it's surrendered. The nervous system learns to self-regulate without external aid. Calm stops being a prize. It becomes a practice. The peace, once outsourced to ritual, is now internal, steady, silent. Relief that requires nothing becomes freedom. In psycho-emotional detox, the sensory field expands again. Colors regain temperature. Silence acquires sound. Even pain feels articulate. It speaks rather than screams. The system reclaims its ability to distinguish between sedation and serenity. Every pulse, every breath becomes dialogue rather than defense. You are no longer suppressing sensation, you are listening to it. As relief dissolves, desire purifies. The same energy that once escaped now expresses. The addict's devotion, once to silence, now belongs to awareness. Rituals fall away, but reverence remains. The nervous system doesn't forget its choreography, it evolves it. Every movement becomes mindful, every gesture intentional. The body learns that true stillness vibrates. Eventually, craving stops announcing itself. There is no build, no collapse, only circulation. Emotion flows through without residue. What used to be relapse now feels like rhythm. The system no longer oscillates between suppression and explosion. It hums with neutrality. Relief no longer follows pain. It precedes it. Awareness moves faster than suffering now. Through somatic reprogramming, we see that the end of craving is not abstinence. It's intimacy. The closer you move toward the impulse without obeying, the more it dissolves. The loop fades because it's being seen. Addiction can't survive observation. It feeds on absence of presence. The same silence that once sedated now liberates. Awareness doesn't need anesthesia. It is anesthesia. And in the final unveiling, relief no longer arrives. It remains. The nervous system, freed from ritual, discovers natural peace. Stillness becomes instinct, not effort. You breathe, and the breath doesn't end. It continues through everything. What once felt like escape is now embodiment. The ritual is complete, but not erased. Transformed. Relief is no longer a pause, it is permanence. Archive 5. The Identity of Craving. Addiction ends not when the craving stops, but when the self built around it dissolves. Every repetition of desire for relief eventually becomes a portrait of identity. The addict no longer asks, "What do I want?" but "Who am I without it?" What began as behavior evolves into belonging. The pattern becomes personhood. You weren't addicted to the act. You were addicted to the version of yourself who needed it. Inside the psychological architecture of attachment, craving fuses with self-image. Each repetition writes another line into the internal biography, the relapser, the struggler, the one who fights the urge but never wins. The ego, desperate for definition, prefers this certainty over the anonymity of freedom. At least pain has a name. The subconscious would rather maintain continuity than face the unknown blank of peace. Every craving, when observed closely, begins as identity maintenance. The tension before indulgence is not only biochemical, it's existential. The body trembles because the mind fears disappearance. Without the familiar sensation, the self feels unsupervised. Through behavioral observation, we see that craving is not hunger. It's autobiography trying to remember itself. Society reinforces this construct. Recovery becomes performance. Struggle becomes currency. The addict archetype turns into cultural identity, a role celebrated for survival, not transformation. Every relapse becomes redemption, every confession applause. The loop survives because it's admired. This is not healing, it's branding. the self becomes marketable through its own pain. Addiction evolves into aesthetic. Within the forbidden psychology of ego design, craving is revealed as the nervous system's language of self-recognition. It says, "I am still here because I still want." Desire becomes proof of existence. Without it, awareness feels too wide, too empty. This is why detachment feels like death. Not because we lose pleasure, but because we lose identity's anchor. The silence after craving feels cosmic, and the mind panics at the size of it. The addict's loyalty to identity is stronger than their loyalty to pain. Craving offers belonging, a way to predict the self. The ritual says, "I know who I am in this moment." Freedom, by contrast, asks for reinvention. The neuro-emotional field of recovery requires constant redefinition, which the ego resists. The self prefers repetition to rebirth. Transformation feels violent because it demands amnesia. And yet, every identity built around craving carries a hidden exhaustion. The story begins to crack under its own performance. The addict grows tired of being the addict. The narrative, once empowering, starts to itch. The same sentences that used to soothe, "I'm fighting my demons," now sound rehearsed. This fatigue is not defeat, it's awakening. The story can no longer sustain itself. When the mask begins to loosen, the first feeling is grief. The emotional intelligence of the body recognizes loss before liberation. You're not only giving up a habit, you're giving up a name. Without the constant hunger to define you, time stretches strangely, minutes widen, space thickens. You feel unanchored. This is not emptiness, it's the beginning of truth. The psyche begins to grieve its former self. It misses the rhythm of compulsion, the small certainties of collapse and recovery. Pain was predictable, peace is experimental. The identity construct clings to the old choreography, hoping repetition will restore definition. But repetition no longer delivers meaning. It only confirms absence. The body starts to feel transparent, as if existence is occurring without permission. In this transparency, identity becomes porous. Sensations flood in that were once blocked by obsession. You start feeling emotions that don't belong to the addict, subtle shades of contentment, curiosity, stillness. These sensations feel alien because the old identity didn't have language for them. The mind scrambles to categorize, but no category fits. This is the crisis of awakening. Reality expands faster than the story that contains it. The nervous system, trained by psychological habit loops, resists this expansion. It generates cravings not for pleasure but for orientation. Each desire is an attempt to return to known parameters. The craving says, "I miss knowing who I am." But you are not missing the substance. You are missing the limits that once defined you. The boundaries of self dissolve, and what remains is raw awareness, untitled, unframed. Freedom feels dizzying. The ego mistakes openness for danger, because openness contains uncertainty. Yet this uncertainty is the natural state of consciousness. The addict who once sought control must now learn to trust flow. Through somatic reprogramming, the nervous system learns to replace compulsion with curiosity. The body begins to move from seeking to sensing. The self no longer chases, it listens. As craving detaches from identity, emotion regains fluidity. Sadness turns poetic, anxiety becomes alertness, desire transforms into inspiration. The same energy that once imprisoned now illuminates. Awareness discovers it was never fighting addiction. It was fighting identification. You don't overcome the craving. You outgrow the self who needed it. The transition isn't linear. Old patterns resurface not to punish, but to test recognition. Each recurrence asks, "Do you still believe this is you?" The answer, spoken softly, begins to change. "No, this isn't me. It's memory moving through me." In that moment, identity stops being owner and becomes observer. With observation, the final layer of identity begins to peel away. the psycho-emotional resonance field starts operating without labels. The self no longer says, "I am healing." It simply exists as awareness. Every trace of old identity becomes compost for consciousness. The addict dies not in relapse or recovery, but in realization. As the mind releases its role, the body discovers simplicity. There's no need to define every sensation as progress or failure. Breathing becomes its own validation. You feel hunger and do not name it desire. You feel peace and do not call it achievement. Life returns to neutrality, vivid, unsorted, alive. The nervous system, once sculpted by craving, now mirrors presence. This is where the forbidden psychology turns sacred. The realization dawns that identity itself was the ultimate addiction, the need to be something, someone, somewhere. Every label, even healed, feeds the same loop. When the need to define dissolves, what remains is consciousness without condition. You are no longer in recovery. You are reality recovering itself through you. The remnants of craving become teachers. Each subtle urge is now signal, not threat. The body learns to transmute desire into direction, not to escape, but to express. Energy flows upward instead of inward, transforming compulsion into creation. You no longer fight yourself. You channel yourself. The same fire that once consumed becomes the light that guides. Through cognitive deconditioning, you begin to notice how identity quietly rebuilds itself even in awareness. The ego rebrands, "I'm spiritual now, I've transcended." But even this is repetition. Awareness smiles at the masquerade and lets it pass. The loop doesn't vanish, it becomes transparent. Illusion can't manipulate what is seen. Eventually, even craving becomes art. A pulse reminding you that energy still moves through form. You stop dividing experiences into higher or lower, good or bad. You see craving as color, identity as texture, life as spectrum. Every sensation becomes a note in the same vibration of awareness. The addict, the seeker, the healed, all dissolve into the same hum of existence. And when you reach this stillness, you realize craving never belonged to you. It was the body's language for remembering aliveness, now that aliveness has no boundaries. The identity of craving has collapsed into consciousness itself. You are not free from addiction. You are free from definition. When the self stops seeking, the soul starts breathing. Archive 6. The Biochemistry of Control. Control begins as chemistry. Every thought, emotion, and craving is built from an invisible tide of molecules negotiating with memory. What we call willpower is often just a hormonal weather pattern. The addict's struggle is not moral, it's metabolic. Within the body's neurochemical architecture, pleasure and pain are not opposites but twin frequencies balancing perception. Dopamine ignites desire, cortisol preserves vigilance. Together, they compose the emotional rhythm we mistake for choice. The mind doesn't crave, the chemistry does. At its core, the dopaminergic cycle is an instrument of focus. It evolved to guide survival, to mark what's worth pursuing. But in a world engineered to exploit attention, this guidance system has become hijacked. Modern stimuli, screens, sugars, validation, all mimic reward, flooding the synapses with false signals of achievement. The body celebrates, the mind believes, and the cycle repeats. The result isn't satisfaction but saturation. Pleasure becomes pressure, desire becomes demand. The stress system completes the equation. Cortisol acts as the internal taskmaster, ensuring the organism remains alert. Its original role was to mobilize energy in response to danger, but in chronic exposure it becomes the fuel of anxiety. The addict, oscillating between dopamine highs and cortisol crashes, lives in biochemical whiplash. The highs shrink, the lows deepen, and the system learns to chase balance through extremes. Control, once biological, becomes behavioral, and later existential. The nervous system doesn't differentiate between external danger and internal discomfort. It reacts identically to heartbreak and hunger. This confusion explains why emotional distress often manifests as physical craving. The psychosomatic bridge between emotion and molecule is seamless. The brain doesn't ask why it feels off. It just deploys chemistry to fix it. Addiction, therefore, isn't defiance. It's self-regulation gone recursive. The system tries to heal by repeating the wound. Every hit of dopamine is followed by a trough. Each relief sets the stage for renewed craving. This rhythm is the body's heartbeat of dependency. It's not evil, it's elegant. The same mechanism that once ensured persistence now imprisons consciousness. Awareness trapped within this oscillation starts to define itself through fluctuation. I feel high, therefore I'm alive. I crash, therefore I must climb. The identity becomes a waveform, existing only through contrast. In the energetic anatomy of emotion, this biochemical oscillation mirrors the duality of control. The mind cannot tolerate stillness because stillness lacks chemical confirmation. Without peaks and valleys, existence feels void. Yet the irony is that the body's most natural state, homeostasis, is chemically neutral. Peace, on a molecular level, has no signature. It's invisible to the addicted brain. So the system, unable to measure equilibrium, keeps creating storms just to confirm it's still moving. The loop perpetuates itself through meaning. Each craving becomes narrative. Each release becomes identity. The addict begins to translate biology into belief. I'm weak, I'm broken, I'm dependent. But these are interpretations, not truths. The body is not betraying you. It's begging for recalibration. You are not fighting impulses. You are witnessing an ancient program trying to update itself for modern chaos. Awareness begins when observation replaces judgment. The somatic intelligence of the body knows its own imbalance long before the mind admits it. Tremors, tension, fatigue. They are not symptoms of failure but signals of adjustment. The addict's body is a scientist conducting millions of microscopic experiments daily. The only mistake is interpretation. Pain means adaptation. Craving means communication. These sensations are feedback, not flaw. The dopamine economy thrives on anticipation, not achievement. Every almost there produces more neurochemical charge than arrival itself. This is why the pursuit always feels better than possession. The system rewards striving because striving ensures survival. Addiction hacks this ancient code. It makes chasing perpetual. Every relief is designed to fade just fast enough to reignite motion. This isn't malfunction, it's manipulation. Within neurobehavioral observation, we see that chemistry can't be conquered through suppression. To fight craving is to feed cortisol. Resistance itself becomes stimulus. The more you control, the more you confirm danger. This is why relapse often follows prolonged self-denial. The body rebels against its own restraint. Freedom emerges not through domination but through synchronization. When awareness begins to move in rhythm with biology rather than against it, the chemistry stabilizes naturally. Control, in its pure form, was never about domination. It was about dialogue. The endocrine system, the breath, the pulse, they are all instruments of communication between awareness and matter. Through psychoenergetic coherence, you begin to hear the body's language beneath craving. Slow down, exhale, listen. Each pause between impulses is an invitation to collaborate with physiology. The addiction breaks not through discipline, but through intimacy. As awareness synchronizes with biology, the concept of craving begins to evolve. Desire stops feeling like invasion and starts feeling like vibration. The limbic resonance field reorganizes itself around neutrality. You begin to sense impulses as waves rather than orders. The mind, once a battlefield, becomes an ocean. Cravings rise and dissolve without collision. The chemistry follows suit. Dopamine pulses normalize, cortisol subsides, serotonin stabilizes the current. balance returns not as event, but as environment. In this equilibrium, you begin to recognize how deeply control was tied to identity. The old self thrived on regulation because it equated surrender with extinction. The addict's need for command was never about dominance, it was about reassurance. But now the body proves a new truth through experience. Surrender can stabilize faster than struggle. The nervous system relaxes not when it wins, but when it trusts. The greatest control is realized in release. This isn't poetry, it's physics. When you stop interfering with the natural rhythm, energy redistributes evenly. The mind's architecture of control collapses, replaced by coherence. The same chemistry that once sustained bondage now sustains balance. Awareness is no longer the observer of the storm. It is the atmosphere in which storms dissipate. Freedom begins in the mitochondria, in the smallest act of surrender at the cellular level. The biological alchemy of transformation happens not through denial, but through permission. When the nervous system accepts neutrality, energy ceases to spike or crash. Molecules begin to harmonize with intention. The addict who once sought control through substance now influences chemistry through presence. Breath becomes medicine. Awareness becomes regulator. The body learns to manufacture its own reward through coherence. Dopamine, once a signal for pursuit, becomes a signal for peace. Serotonin, once the aftermath of pleasure, becomes the baseline of being. Oxytocin awakens not from external connection, but from internal safety. This is the hidden secret of neurochemical sovereignty, the state in which the organism no longer waits for reward, it radiates it. As the psychophysiological feedback loop stabilizes, old cravings reappear as faint echoes. They test the new alignment, probing for entry points of fear. Yet the system no longer reacts, it integrates. Each wave passes through the body like memory through light. Nothing sticks because nothing is resisted. Chemistry follows consciousness. The molecules that once dictated emotion now orbit awareness like planets around a calm sun. This transformation does not erase addiction, it redeems it. Every biochemical storm that once enslaved becomes sacred data. You begin to see that each craving was a conversation, a coded message from your biology to your consciousness. When decoded, addiction reveals itself as the body's desperate attempt to remind you that you are alive. It never wanted destruction. It wanted participation. In behavioral transmutation, the self shifts from operator to observer. You no longer try to regulate the body, you respond to it with reverence. The war between molecule and meaning ends. Awareness and chemistry merge into symphony. The system stops fighting for equilibrium because it has become equilibrium. The addict dissolves not through abstinence but through absorption into awareness. When you reach this coherence, the word control loses meaning. There is no longer anyone left to dominate or to submit. The nervous system hums in unified rhythm with consciousness, and what once felt like craving now feels like current. The same biology that chained you now carries you. Control is not something to be exercised. It is something to be remembered. Peace was always biochemical. And so the cycle completes itself. Not through mastery, but through music. Awareness becomes chemistry. Chemistry becomes light. The addict, long searching for equilibrium, realizes that control was never stolen. It was forgotten. Every heartbeat is the echo of a system already free, waiting only to be felt. Archive 7. The collapse of the loop. Every cycle ends not in explosion but in exhaustion. The system simply stops responding to its own commands. What once felt magnetic now feels mechanical. What once pulled now barely whispers. This is the beginning of collapse, not destruction, but decomposition. The loop loses momentum because awareness has stopped feeding it energy. The craving doesn't die when you resist it. It dies when you stop believing it can complete you. In the landscape of behavioral entropy, the psyche finally meets stillness not as void, but as return. The endless repetition of pleasure and punishment starts to feel transparent, almost two-dimensional. You see the contours of the mechanism: stimulus, surge, satisfaction, guilt, and it no longer hypnotizes. It's like hearing the same melody after understanding its sheet music. There's beauty, but no seduction. The awareness that once obeyed now observes. The neural architecture of compulsion begins to unravel the moment recognition replaces reaction. Each synaptic pathway that once fired automatically hesitates, confused by the absence of urgency. The brain, conditioned to chase contrast, finds none. In this stillness, new circuits begin to form, pathways that support neutrality instead of need. Biology updates itself through observation. The collapse isn't dramatic, it's gentle erosion. The addict's world begins to widen. Sensations that were once binary, good or bad, high or low, start to merge into gradients. The taste of food, the sound of air, the pulse of light on the skin, they all carry quiet complexity. The somatic memory field no longer filters experience through survival. The body is learning to experience pleasure without pursuit. The nervous system, freed from alarm, becomes receptive instead of reactive. The loop loses fuel when life stops being measured by contrast. You begin to notice that even thought slows down. The internal narration, "Should I? Shouldn't I?" loses its rhythm. Words feel heavier, unnecessary. Silence becomes more persuasive than decision. In this silence, there's an unmistakable clarity. The craving was never physical. It was spiritual fatigue. Every act of escape was the mind's way of avoiding itself. But now, there's nowhere left to go, and that's liberation. Within psychodynamic unfolding, collapse is revelation. You see the entire architecture of control suspended in one image, a loop chasing its own tail. You realize it never had an endpoint, because it was never linear. Addiction was time turned inward, looping through memory until memory ran out of energy. The collapse, therefore, is simply the moment you stop supplying the loop with your attention. Energy follows awareness, and awareness has finally gone still. The first emotion after collapse is confusion. The absence of craving feels eerie, almost artificial. The system, used to movement, interprets peace as paralysis. Yet within that quiet unease lies the first real stability. You are not suppressing. You are resting. The craving hasn't disappeared. It's dissolved into comprehension. What once demanded action now invites listening. The loop collapses not because you win, but because you understand. When the craving no longer defines your rhythm, time behaves differently. Days stretch wider, moments feel weightless. Without the punctuation of pursuit and relapse, the psyche experiences continuity for the first time. The emotional time signature resets. You are no longer counting minutes between distractions. You are dwelling inside them. Stillness, which once felt suffocating, now feels like a horizon. The collapse also reveals how much identity was built around interruption. You see that the self you defended was designed by contrast, the struggler, the recovering one, the fighter. When the loop dissolves, those archetypes lose purpose. Through identity deconstruction, you realize that what you called me was just the memory of movement. Without the loop, the ego has no choreography. It floats, disoriented but free. The nervous system now faces its oldest fear: neutrality. No high, no low, just presence. The body, conditioned to extremes, searches for intensity in the ordinary. It feels the breeze and expects ecstasy. It feels calm and expects collapse. This is where neurological retraining begins, teaching the system that peace is safe, not suspicious. The absence of stimulus is not danger, it's integration. Every quiet moment becomes rehabilitation for perception itself. Eventually, the body's chemistry begins to match this neutrality. Hormones stabilize. sleep deepens, hunger softens. The once rigid oscillations of dopamine and cortisol harmonize into gentle waves. Through psychosomatic coherence, energy no longer spikes, it circulates. The system finds rhythm without the need for contrast. Awareness expands not through drama but through depth. The absence of chaos feels like abundance. Emotionally, the collapse manifests as transparency. You can feel everything without drowning in anything. Grief becomes observation. Joy becomes presence. There's no need to amplify or mute. Both exist as equal frequencies within the same field. The nervous system stops labeling emotions as safe or unsafe. It learns to let sensation exist without story. Freedom is not the absence of feeling, it's the absence of distortion. The behavioral shadow of addiction still flickers occasionally, a thought, a scent, a familiar sound, but now it feels like nostalgia, not temptation. The body remembers but no longer responds. The loop echoes faintly in the background, like an old frequency you've outgrown. The craving tries to rebuild narrative, but there's no longer belief to animate it. Attention is currency, and you've stopped investing. From here, healing stops being process and becomes perception. There's nothing left to fix. There's only reality left to feel. The psyche stops using the language of progress. Better, worse, healed, broken. Everything simply is. Through existential resonance, you realize that what you called recovery was actually remembrance, the body returning to its natural vibration. As the loop dissolves, the external world begins to shift in reflection. Environments that once triggered craving now feel neutral, even compassionate. The same streets, the same rooms, the same faces, they no longer hold emotional gravity. The external field has changed because the observer within it has changed. The world is not new, perception is. You begin to perceive control systems everywhere, advertising, social media, human interaction, all built on the same architecture of craving. Yet rather than anger, you feel curiosity. You see how everything mirrors the same principle, attention seeking attention. This awareness doesn't create separation, it creates empathy. Every loop, collective or personal, is simply consciousness searching for contact with itself. The collective addiction field becomes visible. You see that society is not addicted to substances but to sensation. Outrage, validation, productivity, approval. The same compulsion animates both the addict and the empire. Recognition of this unity dissolves judgment. Healing stops being personal and becomes planetary. You are not recovering from addiction. Awareness is recovering from division. The nervous system now stabilizes as a conductor of peace. Breathing no longer feels mechanical. It feels like participation in the present. Stillness vibrates. Movement feels effortless. The energetic alignment between mind and matter becomes continuous. You realize that equilibrium was never an achievement. It was a memory waiting to surface. Eventually, the idea of collapse transforms into something subtler. Return. The loop didn't die. It fulfilled its function. It taught contrast, devotion, awareness. Through metaphysical integration, you see that even compulsion served consciousness. It brought depth to desire and humility to healing. What collapses is not the loop itself, but the illusion that it was ever separate from you. The self that emerges after collapse carries no narrative, only resonance. You no longer identify as recovered or enlightened. You simply exist. The pulse of life, once fragmented, now moves through you as continuity. Every sensation, every breath, every silence hums with the same frequency. Enough. You don't escape the loop. You dissolve into its center until it becomes light. And so the story of addiction ends as all cycles do, not with closure, but with coherence. The craving becomes current. The loop becomes language. Awareness, once fractured, now speaks fluently through matter. The collapse was never the end. It was the sound of integration. The system is still here, but it no longer needs your permission to rest. Archive 8. The Return of Sensation. When the mind grows silent, the body begins to speak. The collapse of craving leaves a vacuum where emotion, once numbed by repetition, can finally resurface. The first sensations are raw, sharp edges of feeling that never had the chance to complete their original rhythm. The addict, stripped of anesthesia, stands before the oldest language in existence: sensation. You were never afraid of pain. You were afraid of feeling. The neuro-emotional system awakens cautiously, like an animal emerging from hibernation. Touch becomes amplified. Temperature becomes intimate. Every heartbeat feels like memory thawing inside muscle. These are not new experiences. They are sensations that were once silenced beneath chemical translation. The nervous system, long trained to fear intensity, begins to rediscover that emotion is energy in motion, and motion is not danger, but dialogue. Through sensorial reintegration, the psyche relearns embodiment. It's not the mind observing the body. It's the body remembering it has always been mind. You can feel thought as warmth, awareness as pressure, recognition as vibration. The boundaries between inner and outer soften. The body no longer behaves like a cage. It behaves like a channel. Energy moves through instead of against. Emotion flows as electricity would through a grounded wire, harmless once connected to source. The addict's fear was never of emotion itself, but of its velocity. Intensity was mistaken for instability. Yet in truth, the faster emotion moves through, the less it hurts. The emotional conductivity field improves with every allowance. Tears no longer sting. They release. Anger no longer burns. It clarifies. Even sadness, once heavy, begins to shimmer like liquid light. Feeling becomes fluid again. A current without story. The same sensations that once signaled collapse now whisper coherence. As awareness deepens, every sense sharpens. Sound carries texture. The heartbeat syncs with breath, and both align with environment. This is not hyper-awareness, it's harmony. Through somatic resonance, the body recognizes itself as ecosystem, a living instrument tuned to the frequency of reality. Pleasure and pain collapse into a single spectrum called presence. There is no good or bad signal, only flow and interruption. The addict learns that control interrupts, surrender conducts. In this stage, emotion becomes teacher. Each sensation arrives like a messenger coded with intelligence. Trembling means release, warmth means circulation, pressure means memory surfacing. The psychophysical dialogue reveals that emotion is not content, but communication. The body was never trying to sabotage you, it was trying to speak. Addiction was simply you speaking louder than your own sensations. Now silence lets them finish their sentence. And when you finally listen without translating, the most subtle miracle occurs. Peace begins to feel physical. Not concept, not idea, but texture. A coolness behind the eyes, a soft pulse through the chest, a grounding beneath the ribs. The nervous system recognizes home, not as place, but as sensation. Peace doesn't think, it breathes. The body, now trusted, becomes sacred terrain. Each movement feels like an act of devotion, not to perfection, but to participation. Through embodied awareness, the addict learns the forgotten art of receiving. Sensation is not something to control, it is something to host. Every shiver, every sigh, every heartbeat is consciousness visiting matter. To feel deeply is not to suffer, it is to allow creation to complete its circuit. In the beginning, this depth feels overwhelming. The limbic memory field releases old recordings, echoes of moments too intense to process when they first occurred. The body replays them, but not as punishment, as purification. Pain is the sound of tension dissolving. Each wave that passes leaves space for more stillness. Awareness witnesses itself moving through density and realizes that sensation is not burden, but bridge. This reintegration reveals how much of life was once filtered through numbness. Without craving's anesthesia, colors brighten, silence grows weight, time elongates, even boredom feels luminous. Through neural recalibration, the mind adapts to this expanded bandwidth of perception. It no longer seeks stimulus to feel alive, it feels aliveness within stillness. The addiction to sensation transforms into intimacy with existence itself. The nervous system begins to recognize patterns of pleasure without dependency. Laughter becomes spontaneous chemistry. Gratitude feels like voltage. Love is no longer event-based. It's atmospheric. This is the rebirth of sensitivity, not as weakness but as superconductor. The bioelectrical coherence of emotion stabilizes the entire organism. The more you feel, the less you need. Here lies the paradox. The deeper you allow sensation, the less it defines you. You feel everything but identify with nothing. The subconscious current that once chained emotion to story now flows freely into awareness. You realize that emotion was never yours. It was universal movement passing through your unique configuration. Sensation ceases to be personal and becomes planetary. The body is not separate from the earth, it's her smallest echo. As the energetic anatomy continues to clear, memory converts into movement. The body no longer archives pain, it circulates it. Emotion loses density and gains luminosity. Crying becomes cleansing, shaking becomes realignment. The process is not linear, but cyclical. Every release deepens receptivity. You become both storm and sky, sound and silence. Awareness witnesses itself through texture rather than thought. And in the midst of this reawakening, one realization anchors everything. Sensation is truth in motion. It cannot lie because it has no language. Every shiver, every flutter, every exhale is the body remembering its role as oracle. Addiction once muted this voice, awareness now amplifies it. When you let the body speak, the universe answers. Eventually, the line between feeling and knowing dissolves. The somatic consciousness that once served survival now serves perception. The body becomes intuition, embodied. It doesn't predict, it perceives. There's no more separation between thought and touch, awareness and experience. Sensation becomes the language of soul made physical. The entire organism functions as antenna tuned to the signal of existence. As awareness continues to refine, even discomfort feels sacred. Pain no longer demands explanation, it becomes participation. The ache in your chest might not be memory. It could be expansion. The trembling in your hands might not be fear. It could be frequency stabilizing. Through psychosensory awareness, every sensation transforms from symptom to syntax. You are learning to read yourself without words. The body-mind dialogue matures into silence. There's no longer a question of whether you're healed or broken. There is only responsiveness. The body becomes weather, sometimes sunny, sometimes storming, always natural. You no longer fight sensation. You forecast it with kindness. Each emotional cloud passes because you no longer mistake it for sky. In this awareness, the concept of addiction loses all gravity. Without repression or indulgence, craving has nowhere to attach. The system, once fragmented, has achieved unity. The bioenergetic coherence between thought and tissue completes the loop that addiction began. What once felt like chemical slavery now feels like rhythmic freedom. You don't manage emotion, you embody it. Even the act of breathing becomes sacramental. Inhale, sensation enters. Exhale, identity dissolves. The body remembers that life itself is a cycle of surrender. Through cellular mindfulness, the nervous system maintains fluid dialogue with awareness. Each moment becomes integration, not of concept, but of chemistry and consciousness merging. By this stage, sensation no longer overwhelms. It orchestrates. the entire being vibrates in unison with experience. Joy feels like expansion. Sorrow feels like depth. Both feel like truth. You no longer categorize. You harmonize. Feeling everything is not chaos, it's coherence. And as the final currents settle, you recognize the purpose of sensation all along, to return awareness to embodiment. You came to this world not to escape pain, but to translate energy into presence. Addiction distracted you from that translation, now sensation restores it. The body has become the teacher, the temple, the text. There is nothing left to escape, only life left to feel. Archive 9. The freedom beyond craving. Freedom does not begin when craving ends. It begins when craving loses definition. The mind no longer divides experience into wanting or resisting. It simply notices. What was once labeled urge now feels like movement within awareness, a small tide forming and fading. The system has remembered its neutrality. You were never trapped by craving, only by the belief that you needed to fight it. The psychological residue of addiction lingers like faint perfume after someone has left the room. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer command attention. The nervous system remains relaxed, the breath wide, the senses steady. Freedom here is not a high. It's temperatureless. It hums beneath sensation, constant and unremarkable. This ordinariness, long mistaken for boredom, is the final miracle. Within this state of coherence, awareness no longer seeks balance. It is balance. The pendulum that once swung between indulgence and suppression has come to rest at its center. Each impulse is acknowledged as information, not instruction. The body's chemistry responds accordingly. Dopamine rises, but not to control. Serotonin flows, but not to numb. Everything moves, but nothing manipulates. Biology and being have reconciled. In this neutrality, peace becomes efficient. The mind no longer wastes voltage on identity maintenance. You're not addict or healed. You're simply alive. The nervous system, freed from narrative, functions with effortless precision. The neuroemotional field now resembles light, responsive, fluid, and unbound. Existence feels neither controlled nor chaotic. It just is. Freedom beyond craving is not sterile. It's sensory. The absence of compulsion reveals texture and simplicity. The weight of air, the rhythm of heartbeats, the way silence holds sound. Through somatic stillness, awareness discovers that reality is endlessly stimulating without being addictive. The more present you are, the less you need. The less you need, the more you feel. Presence feeds itself. What once appeared as emptiness now reveals itself as intimacy. Without the noise of pursuit, the world starts whispering again. The quiet intelligence of water, the patience of breath, the honesty of light. The same senses that once betrayed you now guide you. This is not asceticism, it's abundance redefined. The perceptual bandwidth expands until everything feels like nourishment. And here, an ancient truth reemerges. Craving was never your enemy. It was the bridge that brought you home. Every urge was a messenger guiding you through your own circuitry of attachment and avoidance. Freedom does not erase craving, it translates it. What used to say I want now says I am. The mind, accustomed to tension, tests this stillness. It sends small provocations, memories of indulgence, fragments of identity. But the awareness field no longer engages. It observes them like ripples across a pond. Each ripple reveals its own impermanence. You see that even thought is sensation wearing conceptual clothing. Freedom, then, is not detachment. It's transparency. The body experiences this transparency as softness. The muscles, once armored against emotion, now rest in fluid symmetry. The bioelectrical rhythm slows, matching the natural tempo of existence. There's no resistance left to metabolize. Energy, once burned in struggle, circulates as warmth. Peace becomes metabolism. Steady, renewable, organic. In this state, action arises naturally. You move, speak, and choose without deliberation. The cognitive center no longer micromanages behavior. Instinct and insight operate as one continuum. Creativity flourishes because it no longer carries the burden of proving worth. There's nothing to earn, nothing to justify. Doing emerges from being like breath from lungs. Freedom also transforms relationships. The projection mechanisms of old dissolve. You no longer seek reflection for validation. You share perception for resonance. Through empathic coherence, love becomes circulation rather than contract. You don't love to complete. You love to extend. Others stop being mirrors and become continuations of the same awareness. Even desire returns, but refined. It no longer demands. It dances. You feel attraction without attachment, curiosity without control. Desire becomes dialogue, a way consciousness converses with itself. The energetic intimacy between wanting and witnessing merges. Craving, in its purified form, is simply creation-seeking experience. At this level, even suffering acquires new geometry. Pain no longer fragments the psyche. It deepens perception. You feel sadness without story, grief without gravity. Through emotional neutrality, awareness discovers compassion as the natural response to existence. Nothing is rejected. Everything is metabolized. Freedom does not avoid contrast. It orchestrates it. And as the loop fully integrates, realization dawns. Freedom is not arrival. It's allowance. It's not the absence of addiction, but the presence of understanding. Every pattern, every trigger, every high and low was consciousness practicing recognition. The end of craving is not silence, it's symphony. Now the cycle that once enslaved you begins to serve you. The energetic memory of addiction becomes architecture for awareness. The same pathways that once carried compulsion now conduct coherence. Each neuron, once programmed for repetition, has learned resonance. You feel it, the nervous system breathing with the universe, not against it. This is the essence of spiritual physiology. The body no longer functioning as a reaction to matter, but as a reflection of mind. The inner currents mirror cosmic law. Expansion follows contraction, release follows tension. Nothing is wasted, not even craving. Everything returns to its natural cycle of transformation. The universe is efficient, and now, so are you. In this state, even the idea of freedom becomes unnecessary. There's no one left to liberate. You realize you were never trapped. You were dreaming of walls inside an infinite field. The meta-awareness layer witnesses itself without effort. This is not transcendence, it's intimacy without border. Existence no longer alternates between me and it. Everything has folded into immediacy. You begin to perceive that freedom has always been chemical, electrical, and metaphysical at once. The dance of ions, the pulse of thought, the shimmer of perception, all synchronized. Through quantum coherence of emotion, the individual nervous system becomes an open circuit for universal intelligence. Life flows through unfiltered, and you realize that control was simply the mind's way of fearing participation. There is no more teaching left, only texture. Breath becomes bridge, awareness becomes air. You can feel the molecular quiet of peace, not conceptually, but tangibly. Freedom feels like transparency made physical. Through neural transparency, you sense existence breathing itself through your form. This is what addiction was trying to imitate, the merging of self and sensation. Finally, as perception expands beyond polarity, even the word freedom dissolves. There is only motion without motive, stillness without story. Life moves through you the way light moves through water, refracted, not divided. You no longer seek liberation because awareness itself is liberated. You were never meant to escape craving. You were meant to remember who was feeling it. And so the archive closes with silence. The loop has fulfilled its purpose, the circuitry of compulsion rewritten into communion. Craving was the teacher, control was the path, and awareness. The destination disguised as return. The system is whole. The memory rests. You breathe, and the universe exhales with you. Epilogue: The silent hunger. There comes a moment when even peace stops feeling like an accomplishment. It no longer glows or announces itself. It just is. The mind, emptied of its language of struggle, falls quiet. The body, once electric with urgency, now hums in harmonic neutrality. You walk through the same world, but move as a different element. The hunger that once dictated your rhythm has not vanished. It has evolved. What once wanted to consume now only wants to create. The final echo of craving doesn't ask for substance, it asks for direction. It's not hunger for escape anymore. It's the pull of expression, the desire to let life circulate through you without distortion. The same current that once chased intoxication now fuels awareness. This is the transmutation of appetite into authorship. You realize the loop never imprisoned you, it trained your attention. The fire that once burned your will now lights your path. Within this equilibrium, the inner system reveals its simplicity. There is no longer separation between the one who feels and the feeling itself. Sensation doesn't rise or fall. It breathes. Thought doesn't dominate. It dissolves. You start recognizing that freedom was never something to achieve, only something to stop resisting. The hunger for more has been replaced by the hunger to remain awake. Awareness has learned to digest everything: silence, motion, memory, and meaning. Nothing overwhelms because nothing is rejected. Through existential assimilation, life becomes nutrition for consciousness. Pain refines perception. Joy expands it. The addict was never broken. They were the most devoted student of intensity. The only mistake was believing the lesson was punishment. Now, the air feels denser, not heavy, but alive. The world vibrates through texture rather than sound. The eyes no longer analyze, they receive. You sense existence as movement within movement, the pulse of something eternal hiding behind every ordinary moment. This is not enlightenment, it's embodiment. The sensory architecture of reality has opened, and you are no longer visitor but vessel. Even the word you feels inaccurate. The pronoun collapses under awareness. There is seeing but no seer, breathing but no breather. The old construct of the human psyche, with its memories, labels, and motives, dissolves into presence. The silent hunger remains, but it no longer seeks satisfaction. It sustains awareness itself. The loop has become lineage, the memory of transformation encoded in being. And so the archive closes where it began, inside the body, inside the breath. Addiction was never exile, it was initiation. Craving taught you to feel. Pain taught you to listen. Silence taught you to stay. The hunger remains as reminder that life itself is desire learning to become devotion. You no longer chase completion, you breathe it. The loop ends when you realize it was never a circle, it was a spiral leading you back to yourself.